So hello, everyone, and welcome. My name's Beth Yap, and I lecture in creative writing here at the University of Sydney. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded country on which this campus stands, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, who have cared and continue to care for country. So this place is now a place where we pride ourselves on the production of knowledge and pass it on. And in this, we acknowledge the First Nations knowledges that have always been produced in this place. I'd also like to extend acknowledgement and respect to any First Nations people who are here with us today. So today's event, Writers at Work, will be recorded and available on our SLAM events YouTube site. So we take your participation on Zoom in this event as your agreement with the recording. So please mute your microphones while our speakers are speaking and turn off your videos if you need to. So Writers at Work draws focus to what work means to writers, what kinds of labor are entailed in making a work, sustaining it, allowing it to live and breathe, getting it to an audience. Who does a writer work for? And what processes or pressures produce a work of writing? What forms can that work take? Today's conversation about these things will take about 40 minutes with time for questions after that, and will be followed by refreshments and further conversations for those of us who are in the real world room. Very, very sorry, Zoom. We will think of you. Our writers at work today are Quinn Eades and Francesca Rendle-Short, who are the University of Sydney's inaugural John Rowe Writers in Residence, and we're so happy to have them here with us this week. Quinn is a researcher, writer, editor, and poet whose work explores, expands, and plays with ways to write the body, where writing is what we put on the page, but also performance, song, spoken word, dance, and visual art. His research expertise ranges across queer and trans theory, life writing, trauma theory, feminist literary and critical theory, and creative practice-based research methods. His publications include Rallying and All the Beginnings, a queer autobiography of the body. He's a senior lecturer in gender, sexuality, and diversity studies at La Trobe University. Francesca is an award-winning novelist, memoirist, and essayist who is interested in the affordances of language in, when writing the body, prepositional and queer thinking, ethical inquiry, and value of collaboration and community building, and transnational literatures and literary practices. Her 5 books include 2 anthologies of Asia Pacific and Australian writing, and the acclaimed novel cum memoir, Bite Your Tongue. She's the co-editor of the forthcoming A to Z of Creative Writing Methods. I'm sure we'll refer to it here, which is published by Bloomsbury. And she's also a professor of creative writing in the School of Media and Communication at RMIT University. So these are the short versions of their bios. So look them up online for more work that they've done. So today's Writers at Work conversation is on sending love. Quinn and Francesca's collaborative exploration of what it means to love through the troubling of books, and their collaboration and their collaborative writing practice of making and remaking utopian and dystopian books through desire lines, trust, black and white blackout text, erasure, cutting up interventions, the aside, marginalia, call and response, poetic exchange, sending and receiving. I'm thrilled to invite these 2 eminent, groundbreaking, and generous researchers and writers to speak to us today about sending love.
Ooh. Okay. Oh, yes, here we are. Hello. Hello. It's lovely to be here in real presence and in virtual presence. And yeah, we're just so happy to be talking about this project that we've been working on for a little while now and has its precedence in a lot of other projects that we've been working on as well. And we thought we would just, simply share with you what we're doing, from where the ideas arose from, to how we conceived of this, and to then some of the outpourings of it. And to do that, we, Quinn and I have developed a little, what we call it, show and tell, called Sway. I've never worked with Sway before, but I'm going to be working with it now because it's fantastic. So this is our little Sway, which is online, and we can share the link afterwards because there's quite a bit of material in here, but it's this wonderful program where you can put stuff.
I love that you're doing a Microsoft ad right now.
I hate Microsoft, but this is good. I like this. So yeah, we just thought we would go through it a little bit step by step, maybe, and describe or give you a sense of what we're on about with this project. So maybe you start, Quinn, because Quinn, he started with the idea. He kicked it off.
I did kick it off. Yeah, so, well, let's start with this quote. Love is as love does. Love is an act of will, namely both an intention and an action. Will also implies choice. We do not have to love, we choose to love. And Bell Hooks, in her book on love, she's actually got 3 books on love, writes about this. Love as a verb. It's a choice, it's a doing. It's not something that just kind of jumps onto us and we fall, or it's actually, it's about being present to each other and with each other. And it's love as a practice and a way of working. And I think particularly that comes out of working in academic environments where they're sometimes not always amazing. People gatekeep their research, get very defensive about stuff, don't want to share. And I think for Francesca and I, it's about being generous and generative at all times, and about creating communities of practice, thinking and writing where there's a constant exchange. And that's what's really beautiful and loving about what we do together. Yeah, so how did the project come into being? I think partly it was a result of COVID life. So I was born in Melbourne, grew up in Sydney, and then moved to Melbourne about almost 20 years ago now. And yeah, people know what Melbourne was like. I think it's hard to describe though.
6 lockdowns.
Yeah. And I did 3 full 2-week quarantines, including one in a health run hotel that nearly broke me. And so part of this was about how do we get to each other and how do we connect with each other over time and distance and space, in and with writing and practice. Because Francesca and I are used to seeing each other quite a bit, and we couldn't do that. So yeah, and actually when we were talking yesterday, I can't quite remember the offer that I made, but what I know is that with Francesca, every time I've made an offer, her response has been yes, which is just, I think, the most beautiful way to begin. There's a very fabulous essay called Here Say Yes in Joyce, Ulysses' Gramophone.
Yes,
And it's Derrida writing about the yes, yes. So the condition of yesness is an always already, we're going to do this. And then that yes is wrapped up in the next yes. And so it keeps going on a continuum of yesness. And I think that's a pretty good description of the way that we work together, which is, it's a bit like improv, you don't block, you go yes and. So I'll take that and then what do we do next? And particularly it was, this idea kind of came from having a student said to me when I was teaching not that long ago, that they don't read anything that upsets them. And they said it in this very kind of intense statement, which was just like, no, I don't read anything that upsets me. And I started wondering about that because, and it happens, yeah, there are some books in sort of the history of trans theory that trans people find very, very hard to read. They feel violent, they feel discrediting, they're really distressing, can be distressing. So certainly have to like take the time to know whether I'm okay to touch those texts that are hard, but also that I wanted to. And that my history is as a lesbian and a lesbian mum who was raised by lesbians, who had books like this one, which is Mary Daly's Gynecology, which some of you may have had on your bookshelves at some point. Nearly every house I went into as a child had this on the bookshelf, alongside Our Bodies, Ourselves, Adrienne Rich. So like second wave feminist lesbian writing, which was incredibly important for me, including books like Relatively Norma, which is a book that was published in WA, and it's a story of a lesbian coming out. And actually the picture of it is this cartoon with a dyke riding with a labrys over her shoulder. And there's the labrys on here. So that's the double-edged axe from an Amazonian tribe of a matriarchal tribe. So this is like the symbol of lesbian power. I narrowly escaped the 90s without a labrys on one shoulder and Tank Girl on the other. I'm pretty grateful for that. Yeah, so I started kind of going, shall we work with a book, Francesca? And a book that feels troubling. And so that was kind of the beginning, and you said yes.
I said yes. So we just go down a little bit to the books maybe, because that leads nicely to because Quinn then said to me, so what book are you going to choose?
Where are we going to?
Where are we going to?
Yeah, in here.
Down a little bit further. We've got lots of background in here. Down to our books. Oh no.
Here?
Yeah.
Is that good?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's good.
All right.
So I had to choose what book I wanted to come to that had troubled me or was still troubling me. And unlike Quinn, I wasn't brought up in a family of lesbians. By contrast, I was brought up in a family of creationists and fundamentalist, right-winger protesting people. And my mother was a campaigner against bad books, and her bad books, she wanted to burn them, but her bad books are the books that you're reading. You know, the bad books are those in the English literary canon, like, you know, To Kill a Mockingbird and Catcher in the Rye, etc. She had a list of 137 of them that she wanted to burn. So on my library, the troubling books for me were these Christian apologetics and books to do with raising children in Christian homes. And having come out as a lesbian in my family in my 30s, and now, you know, 25 years later, having been married, I'm now married to my wife, which is really wonderful because we've got now that ability in Australia. My book is this one, wrapped up in plastic, because my parents love to wrap their books up in plastic on their shelf. And it's called, I'll just get the title of it in here somewhere. Oh, where is it? The Home, Courtship, Marriage and Children, a Bible Manual of 22 chapters. And I've redacted this on the front to read home and happy and home. So that's my rewriting of the title, which we'll get to now, because we're going to talk about kind of dealing with these books. How do we come to these books and hold them differently? All right, go.
Go back. How far will we go back?
How far? Maybe
Let's talk about the beginnings of our collaborative work. But clay memory wasn't the first thing. So what's interesting, and one of the things Francesca and I have been talking about, is the way, so one of the things we wanted to discuss was how you actually find collaborators. So it's all well and good that we're standing up here and we're having a lovely time, but if you're used to writing in isolation, if you've kind of absorbed that idea that writers are solitary creatures who only create alone, and which is very much like that, you know, this is the white male writer who has the wife keeping the children away from the study while they write uninterrupted for 8 hours a day.
And feed them food.
Feed them food. And, you know, my experience of writing a PhD with a 2-year-old and a breastfeeding 6-month-old was, as you can imagine, quite different to that. And so there's a fabulous book called Mother I'm Rooted, which you might have come across. Is that Kate Jennings?
Yeah.
Kate Jennings, fabulous poetry, mother poetry. And I really started going, the poetic form is the form for me because it's short form and because I can't do things with, you know, I don't have enough hands. So much of my early, well, I was writing poetry from very young, but that early poetry that I did for my PhD was spoken into a voice recorder while I endlessly walked along creeks with the baby who didn't sleep unless they were moving constantly. So, yeah, it's really nice to kind of have this collaborative engagement and relationship, but how do you actually find each other? And it comes back to the yesness, I think. And 2 days ago, I was talking about all the beginnings and talking about when, you know, when you read something and it's so exciting, it makes you jump off your seat with kind of, and you want to write it. I just want to rewrite things over and over and paste them on my walls and call people and say, I've just read, you know. So that's the feeling I follow too with collaborators. And I've got a few different collaborative relationships, as does Francesca. But it's that following curiosity and following warmth and a feeling of openness, I guess, is how we found each other. Yeah.
We talk about let's talk about what we do, because we can come back to this in questions, can't we? The conception, yeah. I've just rewritten a little conversation here, the dot points from a conversation that we had right at the beginning of this project with each other. How we said that we'd, you know, why blackout poetry, which is and, you know, there are various names for blackout poetry, you know, redacted poetry or erasure, whiteout poetry. If you come tomorrow to our Sending Love workshop, Beth has supplied us with like Tipex, you know, those old kind of Tipex. So you can get whiteout poetry, which I really enjoyed working on because it just gives it kind of a different complection.
But also we've both used typewriters that you have to use.
Oh yeah,
liquid paper.
That's true.
As well.
Yeah, when my first year at university, yes, I was on a typewriter with the Tipex. But yeah, really wanting to kind of shift the dynamic in a way from this idea of what do you do with a troubled text? How do you make it a wellness text? You know, how do you shift this from a book of hate or, you know, disquiet into a book that you can hold and embrace and one that is of love? And how do you do that as a writer? So for us, it's a very slow process and no pressure on each other in terms of what's going to be produced or how quickly it's going to be produced, or a judgment of yourself or the other as to what is being produced. So I'd love you to talk about like the first exchange. So we agreed that we would send each other letters. So we would work with our book and then we would send each other something that we did with the book. And I didn't have a book for my first exchange, but when I was looking at my father's bookshelf, which is where this comes from, his library that I've inherited, this thing fell out of it, which was a letter that my mother had written to me when I left home, and she was very angry, but wanting to bring me into the fold, into the Christian fold. So it was a bit actually from John Milton, which is kind of interesting, that she'd written out in her own hand, which I then redacted, and I sent it to Quinn. I have to say now that Quinn told me this week coming for this residency that he's now lost that, which I think is quite Good, although he rang very troubled by it and really distressed about an hour before we were about to fly here up to Sydney. I can't find it. I've tipped the house upside down and I cannot find this text, but I'm kind of quite pleased about it. Have I got it here? Maybe I have.
I think.
Yeah, there it is. So the one on the left is the full thing, and then a close up, and that's my mother's kind of calligraphic writing on it, and it's on sort of a parchment paper. But it's I quite like it now that it's lost. In fact, I don't want Quinn to find it. I think there's something beautiful about that, you know, because when you send things in the mail, and I mean, does any of us send things in the mail? You know, it was quite an excursion actually to get a stamp and then go to a post box and actually pop it in and then to receive it in the letterbox. And things do get lost in the mail. So yeah, that was lovely. But what about your piece? Because it took a long time for Quinn's to arrive.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's always talking about affect when we talk about this project. We're talking about shame, fear, worry, joy, pleasure, love, and they all kind of intertwine. Yeah, I didn't know what I was going to do with this book, and I'm someone who I read my poetry aloud. I've done a lot of kind of performance poetry, and what I loved about the piece that I made was that it's impossible to perform this. You can't speak it; has to be read. I'll show it. I'll just pop it up into the Zoom.
As in read by somebody reading it, like
you have to sit down with it. You have to sit down with it and you have to examine it. And everything I did just felt really terrifying. I mean, I was the kind of kid who didn't even crack book spines. I never turned over corners. I never had bookmarks, so I would memorize the page number that night and then, you know, go back to it the next day. So the fact that I was writing in a book was quite, it felt really wrong. Yeah, it feels wrong. And so the page that I found in gynecology is about women's bodies, and it's become a kind of rhizome with marginalia, talking about sparking friendship, actually, and joy, sparking with tongues of fire, which is kind of lovely for bite your tongue. But I couldn't send it. I carried it with me for weeks. I felt deep guilt and shame for not sending it. I felt worried that I was letting Francesca down. There was all this kind of, and I was not very well at the time. So yeah, I've been inside for years. This is the most I've done in a long time. I still live in stage 4 conditions most of the time. My health isn't great. I get worried about getting the bug. My partner's in his 70s. We have a new granddaughter, etc. So it took me a long time also to get an envelope and a stamp, and then I didn't trust the postal system, and I've always felt like it's fine. You just, you know, send things and it's all right. And when I did, I didn't want to let it go because I was worried about it being lost. So ironically, I was the one who lost. I was the one who lost the thing. Yeah.
And how does it feel, the tearing out?
Oh, the tearing out feels terrible. But what I love about it is, part of me thinks maybe this is a lifetime project and that I'll be working into this book for a long time, but I'm ambivalent about that because I don't love this book, and it is hard to read and it does do strange things for me. But I love the idea that over time, it'll get gappier and gappier in the spine, and that these fragments will be sort of out in the world and Francesca will be holding them for safekeeping. So they can always be returned to the book. And, you know, I could probably tape them back in, but I need to let the fragments go for them to have a material life, to have a life of their own as an object in the world that moves backwards and forwards and around and gets touched by other people. I love that it gets touched by posties and runs through machines and is eventually delivered by hand. So,
but how do you feel about this book now, doing this? Because I know you worked on it the other day as well.
Yeah, I'm still not sure. I would really like to work with some of them. this isn't the most transphobic book you can find in the world. There are some that are even harder. There's actually an amazing document from the Catholic Church that talks about trans people as an abomination that I've done a bit of work with. And I've also worked with students with articles from the Australian where they, you know, turn transphobic text into love. And it does do the work, but I don't know if I want to be in a relationship with this text for years or decades. Is that answering your question? Yeah. How do you feel about your book?
How do I feel about my book? I feel better now that I've done things to it. I mean, it's really difficult, isn't it, when you have difficult texts and they're familial texts as well, the texts that have been handed down from family, because there's a lot of emotional, I don't want to use the word baggage, but association with the works. Because it's a material thing. Oh yeah, we need to talk about écriture Matiere because it's a material thing, and you're kind of shifting the axis, if you like, of the material, but also the material's attachment to you and your relationship to it. And so there's a kind of a dissociation, a sort of rejection of it, but then you're drawing it closer. And if we think about writing the body and live writing or writing life or writing the living body, it needs to be material. So I feel a kind of a compunction actually to work with this text. And so when I got Quinn's invitation, it was this marvelous moment of, so maybe these texts are kind of here for a reason, in that they're sitting here, they've been waiting for this moment. I mean, I don't mean that in any kind of, you know, spooky kind of way, but a sense that, you know, because in my room where I often work, although I've been moving around because of the pandemic, you know, the library, my father's library sort of sits up there, and it's been a constant in my life. And I've been trying to work out what to do with it. I can't quite get rid of it. You know, there's some sort of attachment. So maybe this project is helping me kind of release and reattach to the book in a way that I feel really good about. And it's funny how it works, because at first I was a little bit in the first one, which you can see up there, I did some cutting out and some overworking, and I really enjoyed the cutting out bit. Like, I really love that, because you have to get something, you know, cardboard in underneath and a scalpel, and you've got to, you know, work with the gutter and get a ruler out, and there's a bit of precision, especially on that left-hand side one, you know, to get the little text box and to decide what to keep and what to let go of. And then in the colouring bit, sometimes I get too enthusiastic and I cover over words, and I think to myself, oh, I wish I'd kept that word because I really like that word. So you become like really invested in the language of the book, but you're reading it in a different way, which is really quite marvellous. So you're, sort of re-juggling the work, and so allowing it to land in a way that you feel there's an association then and a connection that you really can have. That's something to do with joy, which is what we were talking about. Yeah, so I feel quite good and want to do it to a few more of the books, I think.
Where do you want to go next, Francesca?
How are we going for time?
We've got 15 minutes.
Yeah, so maybe let's talk. I want to talk first about écriture Matiere, just to give a kind of the material and the mattering.
Yes,
the two things. Yeah.
So écriture Matiere is a term that I developed in my PhD, which was published as All the Beginnings in 2015, and it's a movement on from écriture féminine, which is Siksu, and she first talks about that in The Life of the Medusa, which was published in 1976 in Signs. So that's still around and you can absolutely read it. It's incredibly beautiful writing and spoke to me very deeply about how to come to writing my body. Yeah, and loosely translated, it's writing women's bodies, women's writing, it's in that space. And at the time I was, you know, I just had 2 babies. So I was really, really wanting to write about, I was fascinated about why we're not writing about fluids. There's no, you know, there's no breast, Siksu talks about writing with white ink, which is breast milk. There's very little on breast, you know, there's not many people writing about breastfeeding and having grazed nipples and babies drinking blood with their milk and how painful it is. And, you know, all I could kind of see was Vaseline over lenses and, you know, mothers gazing adoringly at their tiny babies, which feel like vampires and parasites sometimes, you know, like it's not all joy and beauty. So, yeah, I started working with this term matiere, which means both matter and material in French. And I don't speak French and my accent is appalling, so I do apologize for that. But I love the opportunities for punning and many different meanings that can be carried in French. So yeah, I developed this term écriture matière, and on our walk over here in the park, I just was saying to Francesca, we're doing écriture matière with this. We're writing matter, we're working with material. This is an object in the world. It's interesting to think about bodies of work, the book as a body. Yeah, so is that?
Yeah, that's nice, yeah. Which leads on to this question of and both. Does it? Maybe. Or maybe we should go back to this, which is about the gift. So just a little bit more on this idea of gift. In some of my other work, does this complicate it? No, maybe not. I don't know. In some of my other work, I'm working on this idea of the space of encounter with writers and in between writers, to do with a project that I'm doing in the Asia Pacific, Australia included, a kind of a regional project. And this question of gift comes up quite a bit as to what the kind of implications are and the cultural meanings are around this idea of gift. Because, you know, a gift to one person giving isn't necessarily the same thing as somebody else giving a gift, because often gifts can come with demands, or they can come with expectations, or a sort of a sense of a weight of then the being given to thinks that they need to reciprocate and in equal measure with a gift. And so there's a sense of disproportion or nervousness around that exchange. So I'm really interested in this idea of creating a space of exchange where, in Siksu's words, it's non-acquisitional. So it's not acquisitive as in what we can get, but it actually creates a space where you come together and you can be who you are in that space and kind of offer nothing or everything at the one time. And so this is, in a sense, that is part of this kind of gift exchange, if you like. No.
Yeah.
I wondered if you had thoughts on that.
On the gift, yeah, absolutely. I guess when you were talking, what it made me think of is the pressures to be productive in academia, to constantly produce at a certain level, and in humanities, the wanting the sole authored book as the main kind of evidence, yeah, of excellence and of, you know, being at the height of what you can do. And that when Francesca and I decided to do this slowly, without a deadline and without any idea about the outputs, And we do this a bit together. There's a real focus on process. So how are we doing what we're doing and what's happening when we do that? And which comes actually to your work on community making and making kin is these kind of making these connections where the pressure is released. And as a work, you know, teaching and research academic, that's lovely because it can get quite tiring sometimes. But the gift that we give each other is to make work together. And it's really easy. It's really easy to not make work. It's really easy to get bogged down in administration and for me, grant applications, proving that I should keep my job, and that this process gives me the sense of joy and pleasure that I went to academia for, the love of reading and writing and making. And if that's always brought down to points and ideas about productivity and excellence, then how do we try, how do we experiment, and how do we play? So this is, it's very playful work as well. And it's that's why it feels a bit scary, you know, because when we take risks, we need to be open to what's going to happen. And the generous scholarship, actually, this is my nod to Francesca's beautiful and practice, which is of always bringing, and it's something that I really believe in too, when you've got a job, is bringing other people along. And as a younger academic, so we started working together about 7 years ago, I think. 8 years ago. 8 years ago. I was very new. I was just out of my PhD. I had some publications, but I was still finding my way. And Francesca you were an associate professor then. I was an associate professor, yeah. So Francesca has a platform that I didn't have yet. And so she gave me this gift of, yes, let's work together. And I think that that's something so precious that we can all do for each other. And it's something I really am very passionate about, which is if I've got some space, if I've got a microphone and I've got somewhere to stand, or I've got a page, then how do I bring other people along? Which is why I have this real sense of collaborative art making, and writing and research is an incredibly powerful thing to do in a kind of late neoliberal capitalist university that operates as a business. So, you know, the ways that we're making, it kind of works against those forms of working.
And we've got a session tomorrow actually on the kind of the critical the place for critical creative scholarship within the academy. And I think this project speaks to that. I think it's a very interesting sort of area in Australian universities and overseas as well. There's this real sort of battle on, you know, between what is academic enough and is this academic work? You know, but I'm a firm believer in us being the university, you know, that the university isn't out there, it's actually in this room, in our making and in our doing. And so if we're thinking about this work as a kind of in academic terms, an inquiry, you know, we're inquiring into what it is to send love, you know, what it is to make kind of utopian books out of dystopian books, you know, what is it to re-engage with the body and engage with the body in different ways. So we're thinking about it creatively, but we're also thinking about it theoretically, you know, critically. The two just go hand in hand. So it's always there at the seam, you know, the sort of the joining together and the overlapping and the interweaving. And that's what I love about Quinn as well, that he's really open and inquisitive with that, those kind of the different complexions that we bring. Yeah.
I think it's the willingness to just do, you know, to just actually make something and have a go. And maybe could we go to the live writing from
that's what
Wednesday?
I thought,
because one of the beautiful things about this kind of work is it's highly accessible. So you can give it to, you know, you can work with friends, or if you're teaching with students and they may never have done this form before, it's very easy to for students to work into it immediately. And to have access to a form where they're creating an object very quickly. And you know, the build it and they will come. Francesca and I make things, and then it does generate work. And as soon as we lift that pressure off about productivity and excellence, then that actually frees us. And there's already a number of, I mean, here is a very incredible outcome, which is we get to be here with you and talk about our work. There's, you know, there'll be many kind of outputs from this, and there already are. They're starting to appear. But if we hadn't done the making, if we hadn't sat down and done the doing, we'd be staring at blank pages, probably in separate houses, at separate desks, feeling stressed. So,
but this is the work up on the screen. You can see some of the work that some of our participants did on Tuesday in our live writing workshop, and we're doing another one tomorrow morning, I think. Yeah. What's that? Sorry, 1 till 3. 1 till 3. We're doing another one tomorrow. Oh, it's filling up. Oh, goody. Yeah, it was just really wonderful to see this work appear. The invitation to do it, choosing of the book, and then, you know, all the materials are there. And then these beautiful, really interesting works that I just love looking at and rethinking, and the poetry of them is just so beautiful. And then the cutting out, this gorgeous cutting out and relaying of the text over the text is so beautiful.
This is the wonderful Julie's work, who's been administering this fellowship absolutely incredibly.
And she hopes to, you know, just shut the book and leave it in the place where she found it, I think. Is that the idea? So the next person who comes to the book will see this kind of, you know, reconfiguration. I love that. And can you show the
spiral?
The spiral one, the cutting out of a spiral of it. And what else have we got from that day?
This, I love this one.
Oh yeah, that one. And just to read those words, watch them. Sanguinary, malaria, all in the eyes, said Shakespeare, all in the eyes. Dread, openness, pleasure, completely desperate, broke and vacuous. Love it. Like, it just, the sense of the pop and that beautiful kind of diagram that they did as well, which you can sort of see the figure.
Which, before we go to questions, ties into a lot of this work is kind of working with the idea of compost, coming from Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble. And she's in a longitudinal speculative fiction writing group called Children of the Compost. And they develop this kind of utopia, but they don't work from a tabula rasa. They don't work from the violence of kind of blanking everything out and then building something new from nothing. They work from compost, which is, you know, rich, but it's also, it's dead and alive. There's material already there. I think sometimes there's an idea that as writers, we have to work from nothing always, or work from the blank page or from the very beginning. And that, you know, for me as a writer, but also for my students, I find this is a really powerful way to start engaging people with writing poetry and with making objects and making art, because it's a form that's so incredibly accessible. So yeah, I love the practice for that, that it is a kind of a writing in the ruins, or a gathering what we can from the textual objects around us, and then making something from that. It's not necessarily new, it's maybe a different assemblage, or another way of reading and writing.
So let's take some questions, I reckon. Yes, Beth? Good, yeah, great. So we stop sharing? Or...
Yep.
Oh, yes, stop sharing. Great. Any questions?
I was just wondering if you think about changing the relationships, whether that, especially release and then reattach, whether it actually translated into a sense of reattach and release. Yeah, whether that actually makes you reconsider or somehow shifts the attachment.
Do we need to repeat that question? I think the thing mic wasn't on.
That's okay. Shall I try again?
Reattach and
Reattach and releasing. You were mentioning that it changed the relationship you had to the books that you were working on. And I'm just wondering if that actually then transferred onto an idea of who the book belonged to and how it sat with you, and whether that then, you know, changed the relationship that you had with the person who owned the book or the house, you know, the family that it came from. Awkward question.
It's a very good question. It's hard to answer. I'm not even sure what to say. Do I wish for that? Do I hope for that? Has it happened yet? I think I come back at it just with lots of different questions. I think the joy of a slow practice, which this is over many years, and I hope many years to come, is that those questions can kind of sit there, and that releases me of having to know those answers, because they're very complicated. It's a very complicated set of relationships that I have with my parents, who aren't with me any longer. They're compost. Yes, so I can't answer the question any more of that. No more definitively than that. Yeah, I think because troubled texts kind of sit in amongst troubled relationships. Yeah, and so in a way, this book still remains troubled, even though, you know, I love the work I did yesterday. The other day I put hearts, cut through hearts into the whole thing, and you can kind of see a tunnel of hearts. And so even though it's shifted the axis of it, it's still a troubled text. And I think my relationships with my parents are still troubled texts. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Quinn. Hi, Francesca.
Hello.
This is Barry speaking for those who can't see me. Thank you for the generosity of your work and in sharing your process and work itself. I'm really interested in your documentation practice and the relationship of that to the work itself, how you do it, how you approach it.
How do we do it? Should we show clay memory maybe as an example?
Yeah, that's a
of
good idea. Yeah.
documentation?
Yeah.
So Clay Memory is a collaborative piece that Francesca and I did with Robbie Lathan, who's an amazing sculptor, Yamachi woman and artist. And you will have seen us scrolling past this a little bit of the time. Very strange for me as a trans person. Photographs are really strange for me because I see old kind of photo versions of myself all the time, but I love this photo. So actually, well, cafes is where we start often. It's a beautiful meeting place to talk and bring things through. So we started working with the idea. So there's a prison called Pentridge Prison, which is in Coburg in Victoria. It's I think it's Australia's oldest prison. Ned Kelly was hanged there. And I had heard a story by a Bidjambul elder, Uncle Wesman. A lot of First Nations people were incarcerated in Pentridge in the 50s and 60s. And he tells a story about a prison guard burning his prison record in front of him and saying, now no one will you'll never be able to get out. And so we started working with that, and with Robbie, who is an incredible sculptor and who was telling us about how clay has memory. So you can take some clay and then you can manipulate it and then unfold it. And when you put it in a kiln, it retakes the shape of what you've originally made. And so we decided that we wanted to work with the many, many layers and many histories and stories that are kind of embroiled in Pentridge Prison, in the claimed sandstone from the ground around it. And to do this kind of creative work where we burnt records from archival prison records, and then mashed them into the clay, made pressings from the buildings, and then onto the documentation. So we worked with a photographer who we've got so many photos, it was hard to choose for this actually. And then we started co-writing. So sending it, it's often I often find it's just with collaboration, emailing or a live, a Google Doc is what works. And then the three of us just kept writing on this, and we ended up presenting it at Nonfiction Now in Reykjavik in Iceland a few years ago, and publishing this in a place called Chart Journal, which was amazing. So I don't know that we have particular prescriptive ideas about how we document.
No.
And I think this project is going to take a different form in how we do that. I don't even know. I don't know how this is going to look, but I think it lives in the realm of the fragment. And there was a slide I had up before about future directions and wanting to kind of go into a digital humanities space and develop a 3D digital map with images attached to nodes that can trace kind of lines of where they've been, where the fragments have traveled, and what those connections are like. So yeah, I'm not sure yet, but we write a lot.
We write a lot. It's an interesting one, the documentation, isn't it? It's one that I struggle with as well, because sometimes it's a little bit like in our world where, you haven't been somewhere unless you've got a photo that you've been somewhere. And, you've got to take the photo in order to and put it up on social media to tell others that you've been there. So it's like that, Michael Lunig thing of watching the sunset on the TV, but the sunset's outside. And so sometimes I think there's a tension around it. And I know in a project that I'm working on with colleagues at Matiere, it's a 3-year big ARC project, and documenting, we've got to document everything. And then sometimes just the being and the doing and the making is actually what it's all about, which eschews the documentation, because if you weren't there in the room, you weren't there in the room, and you weren't there in the room, and creating that precious space. And I'm interested in that space of encounter in a way that you can't document. But of course, against that is the tension in universities, and in projects like this and getting funding, that you have to demonstrate, evidence what it is that you're doing. And I think there's always the tension, but I quite like tension. I think that tension and where there's resistance is where the rub is. And that's often the most kind of, interesting part of it. So I love going into that and then kind of writing and documenting that kind of place of resistance, which I really enjoy doing, which is a little bit why I like sway. Yeah, because it kind of sways, like kind of brings you in and out. And so it fancies my fancy. Yeah.
Fancy's your fancy. I love that.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Grace here. Thank you for that. That was really lovely and interesting insight into your work. I'm wondering, and I guess you're touching on this a little bit with what you've just said, but I'm wondering about publication with this kind of slow work and work that's also collaborative. I feel like when I think of, like Australian journals where Australian writing is showcased, it's very rare to see, firstly, collaborative work, and secondly, work that's kind of fragmentary in the way you're saying. So, I mean, publishing might not be something that this kind of work is oriented towards necessarily, but I wonder about that and what kind of space you see in like Australian literature for work of this kind.
I think, we've got a long tradition in this country actually of publishing work that is fragmentary and collaborative and unusual, particularly in feminist experimental writing. So places like, I don't know if you've heard of Axon Journal, that comes out of Canberra. It's a creative explorations, I think is the subtitle. Text Journal, which is the #1 journal for publishing, for creative writing, publishing and scholarship, also does. I think in this country, actually, there's quite a few opportunities for publishing collaborative work that is a mixture of art and writing and poetry. Even more so than overseas. I actually think we're quite open here to publishing that stuff. So I don't get very worried about us being able to publish this, and we absolutely will in various ways.
But it's a good question. You have to sort of be alert to it and kind of seek it out and have a look at what's published. or follow people that you know are publishing in that sort of way that you want to publish, and then follow where they've published. You know, that's often a good way to do it. Quinn mentioned the Nonfiction Now conference, which we went to in Iceland. And in that group, there are some very interesting writers, not just, it came out of America, and there are a number of American writers and publishers, but also in the region as well. So there's more interest, like not more, but there's increasing kind of interest in that. And I think Australia, in a lot of ways, is leading the way. But can I say that it's also about finding kindred spirits, you know, and, you know, maybe some of this will come up tomorrow, because, you know, it's like it's a thesis, like, you know, if you have a PhD thesis, that you've got to find the examiners who'd be, you know, keen to read that kind of thesis. Like you wouldn't give a kind of a hybrid, more experimental thesis to somebody who's really traditional, because they'd look at it and just say, WTF, and say no, you know. So you want to match, you know, it's a matchmaking process as well, which is what collaboration is as well, you know, finding kindred spirits. Yes.
I actually had a question.
Oh, Ben.
I've got 3 questions, but I'll just ask one. Do you get into trouble practicing the condition of yesness? And I'm just thinking about practicing this within, you know, within a university. And, you know, you talk about the resistance and the rub actually being something that is worth maybe sitting in the discomfort of or pushing against. But how easy or difficult is it to do this kind of work, you know, amidst all the other kinds of work that is demanded of one?
Yeah.
This work is a true pleasure for me. It's something that gives me a lot of energy, and it helps me to maintain my excitement about practice, about creative practice, and it reminds me how critical it is to my own health and well-being to be engaged in ongoing creative practice. And it's easy to lose sight of that in the university. I have a problem with saying yes, and I think many academics do. Well, there's a sense that we have to say yes to everything. So part of what I've needed to learn how to do is to say no, and how to discern between where I go with yes and what needs to be said no to, which is it's a trick, and you don't always get it right, of course, but yeah, I mean, there's no is always the flip of yes. And then there's the maybe. Francesca and I talk a bit about ambivalence, and, you know, I feel very ambivalent about gynecology, and yeah, but what do you do? What do you do with that? And that's, we were mentioning the both and. Whenever I get an either or question, I go both and. So yes, no, and maybe, and not yet, and already. Yeah.
Yeah, how do I answer that question? We come from very different universities. So Quinn is at La Trobe University, I'm at RMIT University. So in my place of work, there's a lot of yes going on. Like everyone says yes to everything. So I don't feel the resistance. I think that we're well supported because structurally we've been able to set it up through the Nonfiction Lab. I don't know whether you've heard of that. It's a sort of a research group within writing and publishing at RMIT. And that's a kind of a protective space, if you like, because it's a research group that fulfills the kind of the requirements, you know, of the university to be doing this kind of work. But then it creates a space where researchers, academics, teachers can be a little bit playful and loose. And, you know, if we make mistakes or, you know, it doesn't matter so much. Yeah. So it depends that level of risk, I suppose. So everyone in their own sort of space needs to assess that level of risk. Yeah.
I just have some questions from the chat that I might pass on. Firstly, I want to say hi to everybody who's joining us from the Philippines, the University of the Philippines, Mindanao. Hello, everybody. So glad you could make it, and they're commenting they're having a great time.
Great.
But I might go down to Joel's question here. Hi, thanks for a great presentation. I'd like to ask, what are the limits of language to embody love?
Ooh.
Language is always limited. Yeah, look, that's such a big question. It makes me go straight away to thinking about trauma theory and, you know, that trauma, Lacan talks about trauma being at the limits of language and what we can and can't say, how that plays out in the body. And love is something that plays out in the body too. You know, I grew up thinking that love was always connected to pain. And that's just how love was, that it was, there was always going to be pain attendant with love. And I mean, I guess that's why I have a making practice alongside a writing practice, because, you know, in the same way that we can always try to write the body, but we can't ever actually come to the body and do it with language. And I think the same, I mean, I think the tricky thing about writing and working with the concept and the idea of love is that it's so steeped in cliche, in cultural representations, I mean, it's hard not to go to Hallmark cards and pink hearts and some love is just desperate and strange and difficult. And yeah, I don't know. I think that, yeah, I think that, yeah, that language does have limits, and that I guess that's why I come back to working at the level of the fragment, and then down to the sentence level, and then down to the level of the word. And then in this practice, splitting words into phonemes and adding things in, because, and Siksu talks about this, about breaking patriarchal language structures. So if we're always working in this particular form of writing that signals an expertise and a kind of, I don't know, a grammatical excellence, that when we start breaking that apart, that, I mean, I think it's in the gaps that we can almost, that's where we find bodies and love in writing. It's a hard question. It's a great question.
Great question. That's a PhD question.
Yeah, that is a PhD.
A whole thesis.
Yeah, it is.
Because love is troubled, as is language is troubled. There are limits in language and limits in love.
And limits in English.
Limits in our body, and we're talking English, of course. We're working with English books, and our body's limited as well. Like we carry skins around with us. So there's a kind of a skin around love and a skin around language. And what we're attempting to do is kind of break that up, as you say, into smaller and smaller parts. And language anyway is a symbolic form of communication, you know. And so you've got the whole kind of psychoanalytical kind of space in which we're working. So it's wonderfully complex and contradictory and paradoxical.
And just briefly going to Auslan, which might sound like a bit of left field, but I was an Auslan interpreter for 10 years, and Francesca's learning Auslan at the moment. And I would say if there's, are you talking while I'm talking? I would say that Auslan lends itself to that's a language that can speak love, because it's coming from language, body.
Yeah.
And there's so much emotion that you can place in that, and that's a language that can be absorbed, you know, even more than read, and it's fluid, and it happens. It's a bit like theatre. It sort of happens in space and time and between bodies, and then
across spaces.
Yeah,
I swim, and we can do Auslan, you know, across big.
Now, everybody's getting very excited now. They're all ramping up on the chat, but we are going to just take one more, and I might go to Joanna, who is in the Philippines.
Joanna.
And her question is, or their question is, what aspects of this project arose particularly from your queer identities, or does it matter? Sorry if that's a bit essentialist. So we might finish on this question.
Look, I think, is it all right if I?
Yeah, you jump in. I'm thinking.
I just think about form with this. So, you know, sometimes people think queer trans writing is writing that's been written by queer and trans people, and they're queer and trans stories. But for me, queer trans kind of writing is always playing with form and is actually queering what and transing what we can do in and with language and how we tell stories and with who and who's in those stories. So I think for me, I mean, how do you unpick it? I've been out since I was 13 and I grew up with queers. So I've been in queer community all my life. So absolutely it comes from my queer trans life, because it can't not for me. But,
Well, and it can't not for me, I think, because the more I've played with form, the more I've played with form. Yeah. I'm not sure whether I can answer more than that, really. Yeah. Sorry, Joanna.
I think on that note, we thank you so much for sharing those ideas and insights and ways of working with us today. So thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks, Beth.